Hello everyone, my name's Martin. I'm going to give you a quick talk about music and how to make chiptune music, and I'm going to use one of my existing tracks that is not chiptune and turn it into a chiptune track to kind of give a process overview. So first off, what is chiptune music? I've got a few examples of it. You've been hearing it all day around here. These are some like music pieces. Chiptune essentially is the music you get in old video games like Nintendos and Mega Drives. And it's kind of had a resurgence in recent times with people making music not for games but just for pleasure, and it's become a kind of a genre of music in its own right. So you've got sounds like Nintendo, which sounds a bit like this. This is some of those more simple, very old sounding tracks, like very simple tones, a little bit of noise for the drums and stuff like that. It's good stuff. And we've also got the Commodore 64 is like that, but a little bit more deep. There's a bit more variance to some of the sounds in it. This is R-type. There's a bit more like the bass line, the wave that's used for the bass line is a bit more gritty, a bit more deep sounding, which is great. I'm just going to skip a bit of this one because it's so good. It's a bit more melodic as well and stuff like that, so that's good. The Mega Drive was a different chip entirely from the ones you just heard, which uses something called FM synthesis, which just generally sounds a bit more modern in an 80s style. This is Sonic the Hedgehog, which I'm sure you've all heard. So the bass line in particular in this is really good. It's got a kind of gritty, it's got a kind of 80s pop sound to it. It's like really nicely deep. Lovely melodies. I'm just going to pop out these really quickly. This one's interesting because it's going back again to really, really simple, but it's a version of an existing track. This is on the Atari 2600, and it's the Atari 2600 version of the Ghostbusters theme. You can hear there's basically so little from the original song in there, but they've tried to mimic what was there already and kind of make it recognizable, which is kind of what I'm going to be doing today. There we go, brilliant. So I make music as two different artist names. I've got an artist name of Binster, and I make quite modern, normal dance music with that. And I also have an artist name of Mpegasus, and I make chiptune music with that name. And I'm going to be taking one of my Binster tracks, and I'm going to be rebuilding it in the style of Mpegasus. So the Binster track I'm going to be remaking is this one called Anisymmetric, which sounds like this. It's kind of relatively standard sounding dance music. It's made up of different layers, like it has a drum beat. This is the drums. It's got a bass line. And here it's got a bit of reverb on it and stuff like that. Some melodic aspects. And some more, like there's various melodies at different levels. And like choral stuff in the background, and so that's kind of how the track is built up and kind of grows in different ways. So it's kind of where this differs from chiptune is that you can multi-layer so much, and all the sounds are so deep and organic sounding, whereas chiptune is much more robotic. So that's the challenge that we have when you take something and you try and remake it in a different style. So that's what I'll be doing. I'll be going through remaking this element by element today. And the best place to start is with the drums. So let's have another listen to the drums as they are. Drums generally boil down to a few core elements. There's always a kick drum, which is the boo. There's a snare drum, which is the k. And then there's the hi-hat, which is the t. And you generally make your drums with that as a basis, with a boom, psh, tss, and build up from there. And you can hear it in this one. So boom, psh, boom. That's essentially the elements needed. What I'm going to be making this music in is a package called Reason, which contains soft synthesizers that are like all the synths you see around here today, but just replicated in a computer. I've just created some patterns already beforehand in a Blue Peter style, and I'm going to take the synthesizers I've built up around them and make them sound kind of like drums, but in the computer game style. So for example, I've made this drum pattern for the kick drum. Doesn't sound much like a drum yet, does it? It's rhythmic, but it's not really like drum sound. So one of the things that's one of the main challenges you have with drums in simple synthesizers is to take something which has no tonal elements that are similar to something that exists and make it replicate it. With drums, they generally have a low tone. They have like a deep sense. So what we can do with that is we can take the octave of this synthesizer, bring it lower, really low, pull up a little bit there. But that's a bit too low. There's not like an impact to it. There's not a kind of a punch. But you can give it a punch if you make the pitch of the sound start high and drop low, which is what I'm going to do with this. So this element here is the mod, and it's like an envelope that will affect different parts of the sound. Currently, it's affecting the oscillator's pitch. So as I turn this knob up, it makes it start higher and dip back down to really low. You see here, that's now giving it a bit of a punch. So if you go really high, it sounds like a laser. But yeah, you want to bring it back down a bit and just make it a bit more, just find that right level. So that's essentially what I'm going to do with that. That's pretty much the kick drum sorted. So that's kind of giving it the rhythm. The snare drum is a similar thing where it's just, that doesn't sound like anything like a drum. But I'm going to be basing this around the Nintendo for this drum. This module here replicates different chipsets. Currently it's a 2600. I'm going to make it into a Nintendo. So this is like a NES. And one of the wave settings it has is for noise, short noise and long noise. Long noise sounds a little bit more pleasant on the ears. So the main thing you need for a snare drum is a tail. It needs to have a little bit of like extra time on it. And you can do that by taking the release of a sound, which is just when you stop playing it, how long it continues to play and fade out afterwards. If you bring that up, you're getting a bit more of a kind of a drum sound to it there. So what else do I do with this one? You can also, I mean, that's not bad for a kick drum sound. It's kind of like when played with the kick, it's not bad for a snare drum. Play it with the kick. It's kind of beginning to sound a bit like what you expect these things to sound like. You can give it extra flavor by changing the pitch. Hang on, let's solo that again. So what I'm doing here is making it so that even though it's noise and doesn't really have a tone, making it change slightly over the time the drum plays, so you get a different character to it. It just gives it more of a, makes it more interesting sounding than just like flat noise. So that builds those up. Now we've got the hi-hats. They're kind of noises. These are pretty simple again. They're very similar to the snare drum. We just make them into noise. Let's bring that down a bit. But again, they need a tail. Not as long a tail as a snare drum though. That's essentially it for the hi-hats. We can also do a high-pass filter on them just to take the bottom end off. Just makes them sound a little bit more pleasant. Just it takes off the bottom end. Another thing you can do is make it, like you can see here where my mouse pointer is, these levels here are what the volume information of the triggering of the sound. And I've made it so that there's one loud one followed by other ones that are quieter. You can use that with the amp mod, so you get more of a kind of flavor to it. It kind of kicks in between the drums and the kick drum and the snare drum. That's essentially the hi-hat. So that's essentially the drum pass done. I've already made a version which is slightly more polished, which we're going to have a good listen to now. This is with a little bit more time finessing things. So yeah, the other addition I added was like a crash cymbal here, which just gives a kind of a big splash when you get into a new section. It's just like a hi-hat but with a longer tail, essentially. So you can see all these elements sound very different, but three of them are the same sound. The only different one is the kick drum, which is from a square wave, which is just like a whole different thing. So that's phase one. Next step is the bass line. And this is what it sounds like in the original track again. So it's quite simple. It's kind of off-kilter, off-timing. There's a bit of echoey reverb in the background. So it's going to be an interesting one to try and replicate. But it shouldn't be too hard. So I've made a bass pattern for this again. That's how we're going to start. You can see that's a bit too high pitch. It's not really good. Let's knock it down a few octaves. That's pretty good. That's a bit better. It's a bit squelchier. And also a good waveform. There are different waveforms you can use, like the standard ones that are built in. This is the Sawtooth Wave, which is kind of rasping like a saw. There's the Square Wave, which is a bit more pleasant on the ears. It's a bit rounder sounding somehow, but it still has some roughness to it. The Triangle Wave is even softer and is good for like subtle bass lines, but it's slightly peaked. And then the Sine Wave after that is the softest of all, and you can barely hear it. You can hear that just really rumbling along in the background. But we're doing quite an upfront bass line for this track, so we're going to take it back to the Square Wave, which is this one. This is very popular in Game Boy DJs when they do music, modern music for dance. They use the Square Wave quite often. We're going to do something with it that makes it sound even better, which is we're going to let it have different phase passing. So essentially, a Square Wave looks like this, and you can change the phase, which makes one half of it bigger than the other half. So one half at the top and the bottom half, you can squish it over to one side or the other side by turning this knob, which gives it a different sound, makes it slightly off even, and as you push it even further and further, it eventually just vanishes completely. That's too far. That's not good for bass lines. So you have to bring it back down again. As you can see, that sounds great. That's like a really weird sound. What sounds even better than just setting it to a value is you can take something called an LFO, which is a low frequency oscillator, and use that to drive the setting of a different part of the synth. So I'm going to use that. It basically makes a very slow number change over time. I'm going to use that part to control the phaser of this bass line. So if I play this now, and then bring up the amount, so you can hear that's kind of like, it's got more depth to the bass line, makes it sound interesting. And that, again, is essentially it. The other trick, as we had in the original, if we go back to the original version that we're replicating, the bounce, oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
What did you say? You use the LFO to change the parameter of the...
Yes, sorry, if I should have said at the start as well, if I'm going too quick, if I glossed over anything, feel free to interject. Yes, so this synthesizer element, I'm using a package called Reason, and it has built-in synths like this one called the Subtractor. And you can use these lights down here to change what that LFO affects. So you can sort of pick, it can also affect the oscillator pitch. So if I put it to oscillator and press play, so it's now changing the pitch as opposed to the phase, which is like that. So it's like, that's you can use that to kind of like make things sound different as you need them to. Like changing the pitch with an LFO is good for kind of more melodic elements in the background because it gives them more of a live, active sound. But yeah, for this situation, I'm using it for the bass line. It gives it a kind of, it's kind of, yeah, that pulse width is a deep thing that you get a lot. It's one of the few tricks you have for chiptune music, so it's one that gets used a lot. But yeah, thank you for interjecting, because yeah, I hope I'm not going too quick. But yes, another aspect of the bass line as was is the reverb, the echoey sound. Sounds like it's big. That's very hard to pull off because there's no, you can't add an effect on top of a chip. You know, kind of chip is all it is. It's internally controlled. But you can use the space in between notes to kind of provide that. So on this one, as an example, if I throw in a quieter note afterwards, so it sounds like it's re-echoing, sounds like it's kind of, it's faking that it's a more deep, complex sound without actually doing it. So yeah, let's have a listen to the polished version I did beforehand again, like on Blue Peter, along with the drums. That's sounding pretty good. So yeah, that's not too far away from what we started with. It's kind of similar, it's kind of close enough, but there's always going to be a difference, which is good. So the next step is more of the melodic parts. This is quite a synthesized sound anyway, so it's not too far away from what we'll be doing. And this extra element here. Oh. That's going to be a difficult one to replicate, so we'll see what we can do with that one, because it's quite a complex sound. It sounds like a cat. So, we have two more patterns to play with. Again, with just the fresh default sound of the synthesizers built in. So, what are we going to do with this one? We are going to... You have to refer to my notes at this point. We're going to change this oscillator. It's already on Sawtooth, which is good. But we're going to give it some phase ability, which is kind of like what we did with the square wave, but on the Sawtooth. And by changing this knob, we can change the flavor of it, make it softer or harsher. So we leave it about there. That sounds pretty good. And we're going to bring in another oscillator. So these can play two tones at the same time. We're going to bring in oscillator 2, and we're going to set that to sine wave. And that's the one we talked about before, which is really, really soft. It's like, yeah, it's like you can barely hear it. It's really good for low-end stuff, but when you bring it up, it gives it a bit more character. And that's good as it is. We're going to bring it up an octave as well. So mixed together, they kind of sound like there's something interesting going on there. Before we used the mod envelope to control the pitch of the bass drum. So we made the pitch start high and drop back down. We're going to do a similar thing now, but with the mix of the two synthesizers. So going from the Sawtooth to the sine wave, we're going to make it start strong with one and then move over to the other one. Which I'll be doing with this, change it to mix. See, as I change it up, if I bring this down as well. So this essentially gives the tone, it's kind of like it starts sharper and gets softer, almost like a bell. Bells kind of do that as well. That could give this the kind of thing, which should work really nicely in the background for one of the melodic aspects of the track. I think that's good. Got some numerical stuff to play with as well. D59. R62, amount 29. So that's not too bad. But it cuts off very quick. That's not really what we want. We want it to kind of carry on more like a bell. So if you bring up the release on the old envelope of the amp, that'll let it play longer after it's been triggered. That's sounding better. Yeah, that sounds good. And we're also going to use the LFO, the low frequency oscillator, and we're going to just give that the pitch of the sound a little bit of a wobble to make it sound a bit more natural and organic. There you go. Sounds a little spooky. So that sounds pretty good. And then next is the cat piano. Where do we get to with that? So that kicks in at this point. That is not a cat piano. That is very far away from a cat piano. We're going to have a work cut out for us here. How are we going to deal with that? So we're going to use the pulse sound. We're going to go with, pulse. We're going to use the Commodore 64 sound for this. I'm going to change the pitch to, where are we going? Oscillator +1. So it makes it a little bit higher pitch. That doesn't sound right. That was too high. It sounds weird, but it will work, trust me on this one. All we need to do here is give the envelope a little bit of a tweak. So we make it so it starts a little softer by giving the attack. The attack is the initial slope up from silence. We give that a little bit so it softens the intro, and we give the decay and the release a little bit longer to play out, so it kind of tones off at the end. And that sounds nicer. And we're going to have a little wobble on the pitch. So we're going to use the LFO on the pitch, a tiny amount, just 1%. It's not quite a cat, but it's kind of, it sounds spooky, so that's always good. They sound like interesting sounds. So let's see how they sound with the rest of the track. It's building up, it's going somewhere now. That sounds pretty close to what we had before, in a kind of weird parallel universe of it. Because yeah, with that other cat instrument, it was playing chords at once, and you can't really do that with chiptune, so you kind of have to sacrifice some of the notes and we'll go with the most recognizable, most hearable notes. So what's next? Next is the melodic parts, I think, the lead, which is this aspect. Quite a realistic sounding kind of guitar sound. That's going to be a tough one to make. And there's also a chuck synth, which I think is over here. So it's like it's in the background. It goes do 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 do, that kind of sound. And there's another synth later on, I think here. So we've got 3 more bits we're going to work on right now. Let's have a listen to the defaults. There's the lead. That's going to take some work. There's that other synth. And what else have we got? So let's have a play with this lead. So that's too sharp, I think, right now. Let's try a triangle wave. It's softer. There we go. But it's still got a little bit of roughness to it, so it's not so bad. I'm going to push it up an octave. And we're going to make it poly 2. So polyphony. We're going to give it 2 cases of, like, 2 amount. It can play 2 voices at once. Ordinarily, you'd only play 1. We're going to allow it 1 more, just to give it a bit more flavor. And we're going to do something which is particular to this synthesizer, but is used a lot in chiptune, where we're going to have a rapid playing of 2 notes. It's called sequence in here. We're going to set the length to 2, so when you play 1 note here, it'll play another note immediately afterwards, which will be 12 semitones higher, so it'll be an exact octave higher than the one you just heard. And it's going to be very, very rapidly played just after. Like, really rapidly played. 83%. You can hear that's kind of like, you get a kind of 2 tones at once, and you get a real kind of chuck sound. And then we're going to do some other stuff. Just give it another tail, because these things always sound nice if they just die out a little bit. Sounds pretty good. The chuck synth, this one's going to be an interesting one as well. This one. We're going to do a similar thing with this. We're going to give it a sequence as well. So it's going to be 2 notes, 12 semitones high again, very rapid, 93%. But we're going to take the polyphony down to 1, so it's only going to play 1 note at a time, which means you won't hear 2 at once. So that's kind of an interesting sound already. Oh, and it's going to be a square wave. There we go. That sounds pretty good. And then there's one more instrument, which I think comes in halfway through. This one. Which you couldn't quite hear. I'll see if we can find it again over here. So it is in the background. We're going to do something interesting with this. We're going to go a little bit weird. We're going to move it away from the source material. We're going to give it 2 square waves. One is going to be an octave higher than the other, and we're going to make it rapidly jump between the 2. So kind of like what we just did with these ones with the square wave. That's kind of going from one octave to another. This one's going to go backwards and forwards really quickly. So we're going to use the LFO, but instead of it being a smooth number change, we're going to change it to a hard square wave jump between 2 numbers. And we're going to put it to the mix, so it's going to mix between the 2 synths. We're going to put it to the max mix, and we're going to put it like very quick. But we can make it synchronized with the music, with the melody, the tempo, and make it so it changes every 32nd, I think, of the track. So it sounds like this. If we give the tail, that kind of weird rhythmic kind of feel to it is an odd sound and not like the original instrument, but I think gives it a depth in the actual track itself. And I think that's those 3 instruments done. Let's have a listen to the polished versions. So there's kind of the rhythmic aspect with the chuck. There's a more smooth with the melody on top. And you can hear that one, that weird octave jumping one there. So that's just a little bit smoother sounding than the one we had before. So that's sounding good. Let's close some of these old files down again. So what's next? Page 2 of the notes is what's next. And it's the chorus. So in the original track, after the verse is finished, so we've got some interesting elements to play here. There's a lead element. Those bits are going to come later. The lead is the more important thing right now. So we're going to play with this. Let's have a look. So again, I've done the pattern already because it's quite complex. This is actually done with MIDI notes, whereas most of the other stuff I've done with just patterns. This one I've played the notes in on a piano roll because it's quite a complex melodic piece. So I've kind of like, I've taken it there. So that's that. There's a difference there. Generally, when you're making music in like Commodore 64 and Nintendo, you wouldn't do much with like MIDI notes. You'd be programming them in like numerically. So there's more of a concession to modernity with these things. But how does it sound? Painful on the ears, so let's make that nicer. So for one thing, we're going to make it from a sawtooth, we're going to put it into Game Boy mode, and we're going to use square waves. Which sounds pretty good, but we're going to take the opportunity at this point to replicate something that happens quite a lot in modern Game Boy music, where they'll take, the Game Boy can make 3 different pulse width sounds. It can make a half pulse width, which is really smooth, a quarter pulse width, which is a bit sharper, and a 16th pulse width, which sounds like this. So that's the quarter, that's the 16th, this is the quarter. Bit softer. Oops. And then that's the half, and it's like the smoothest of all of them. People often rapidly change between these pulse widths to give a different flavor, again, to the instrument. And we can do that when we use an LFO, which is an external one. It's going to take some external routing, so we're going to have to flip the rack around. One of the great things about Reason is on the back of all these synthesizers is a bunch of cables, and you can plug things into different areas. So what I've done is I've got this external unit called an LFO, which is just sending number information into a different aspect, into a different program, into this combinator. And this combinator just takes information and passes it through to different synths, including this chip synth, which it controls. So essentially, it's kind of convoluted, but I'm going to make this bit here control which wave is playing in the synth. Currently, I've got it set to, jump between 16.5 based on this knob here, which is being controlled by the lo-fi thing here. That's not sounding right, though. This is where it gets a bit complicated to do live. Let's have a look. So that's plugging into there. That's controlling that. That's on that. Oh, this is just too quick, I think. Oh, and it needs the volume up. There we go. So you can see this knob is jumping up and down. That's being controlled by the LFO. So it kind of makes it sound like weird and different. Every time it plays, it's much more organic sound. So that's pretty good for a lead. I think we're going to give it a little bit more tail as well, because it's not nice when it just plays constant volume all the time. So we'll have it die off a little bit at the end. That's better. Good stuff. We've also got another synth we couldn't quite hear in the background before. Where is it? This one. Oh, that's the wrong button. I soloed too much stuff. So it's not too important an instrument. We're just going to give it a different sound. Where is it? There it is. Take the filter open. I think the only thing we're really going to do is just give it a little bit of wobble to the pitch. So we'll give it about 20 on the LFO. And again, give it that tail. There. So there we go. So if we put that all together, let's have a listen to the polished version. Sounded pretty good. It's not too bad. But there's one thing we're missing. If we go back to the original track and have a listen to the chorus again. Where's the bass line? Oh. Need to do some bass. And as you can see, this is kind of different to the original bass line. Before we had that echoey, but now we've got a different instrument playing entirely. So let's use a different sound. What we're going to use is FM synthesis, which is weird and difficult to explain. I'm not quite sure how deep I can go on that, because it's not difficult to explain it. In fact, if anyone here can explain FM synthesis, no, we'll carry on. So essentially, the way it works is you take different waveforms and you layer them, and one waveform will affect the pitch of another one, and then that one will affect another one beyond it. It can very easily get very messy, is the main thing to watch out for, but you can get some very nice sounding bass lines. This one, it's not quite there yet. We need to do something with it. And the wonder of it all is this stacked waveform style you have. You have one at the bottom, two, then three, then four, and they get fed together in a particular order. Currently, well, according to my notes from messing around with it the other night, we're going to give it, the first one is going to be a sine wave, and it's going to be at octave 1. Second one is going to be a sine wave as well, but we're going to give it a slight tweak to the pitch. So when we change that, and we bring it to the correct level, it'll give the original synth, the original pitch, a kind of weird sound. So you bring it up. That's what happens when you go too far. That third oscillator is going to be a half sine wave. So instead of it being just a standard sine wave like we had before, we're going to take it down to like half and then cut off to give it a different feel. And that's going to jump a bit in octaves. That is going to be 6. So that's going to be a 6 octaves high. So that's definitely a bit more interesting. We're going to make it mono. We don't want two notes playing at the same time in a bass line. So you only get one at one time. And we're going to make it so there's like, they have that envelope feel to it again. Also, I think the whole thing needs to be an octave below. So we're going to take it down. That sounds a bit more like a bass line. So that's not too bad. Also, we've got another instrument to pick up at this point. I'll skip that. We don't need to necessarily go through everything, but essentially we're just going to make it very soft. Triangle. Give it a slight wobble again. Give it a tail again. That should do the trick. So, let's listen to that bass line polished. There we go. It's got that kind of Sonic the Hedgehog feel. So we're nearly there. We've only got a few more elements to play around with now. One is, when that first chorus is finished, we get into the second verse, we've got a new instrument. So let's have a play with that one. Okay. There's a lot of rattle on that. Let's take it down a little bit. It's probably a bit too loud. Right, it's another FM synthesizer. We're going to do some interesting sounds with it. So we're going to take it up to a 2 to begin with, and a 4. So we've got 2 octaves and 4 octave. And this one's going to be another 4, but we're going to bring it down slightly below to 3.98, so it's got that phasing aspect. And this one's going to be a 4, but slightly above. So it'll kind of play off each other, hopefully. Level 10, 6.9. 7. There we go. Just playing with those levels, trying to get a more of a tail to it, more of an intro feel. We're going to give a little bit of LFO to the pitch again. Give it that wobble. That sounds okay. That sounds all right. Let's have a listen to how it sounds in the rest of the track again. So yeah, that sounds soft but fits in nicely. That sounds like it works pretty well. There's only one last thing we're going to try and replicate now, and this is the toughest bit to do in chiptune stuff because it involves many notes played at once. It's doing chords. And a trick that people use when they're doing chords is to play notes really quickly next to each other. So if we have to listen to some of the chords in here. So that kind of thing. That's playing through 3 notes at once, kind of different structures, very softly in the background. It's a really tough thing to do when you don't have that much polyphony. And you can only play 1 note at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and play 3 notes at the same, like very rapidly together to fool the ear into thinking, treating them as if they were just the 1 note. This is going to be very soft, just a little bit of stuff in the background. So there we go, 3 notes. That's pretty quick, and we're going to make it a triangle so it's soft as well. Maybe give it a little bit of, yeah, we've got a little bit of offset there as well. That's pretty good, but we can go faster with it. If we go even quicker, push up to about 1 every 32. It sounds a bit weird, but it's kind of got a unique kind of feel to it that makes it feel a bit like a chord, but also very particular. So we go through these patterns and push them up to different new speed. That should be it. That kind of works. That's kind of like how chords work, sort of, in a weird approximation. So that's it. That's the last piece of the puzzle, I think. If we have a listen to that with the rest of the track around it. There we go. That kind of fits together quite well, and it kind of mirrors that. It's kind of, you can tell it's the same notes, it's the same chords, it just doesn't sound anything like it, but yeah, it's the points when you have to make those concessions. And this is the bit like in a track, when you do dance music, you have a kind of breakdown where it goes quiet and then comes back stronger. So that's what this bit is. And we've kind of done that in the chiptune as well, where we've taken the drums apart and stripped them back in a lane and back in again. So we bring a kick drum in. And then bring in this snare drum. So building it back up. So whereas in dance music you do a lot with filters and things to make sounds go away, sometimes you just have to do things with volume or just not as many notes playing at once. You just kind of work it through as you can. So that is that. And then if we have a look, the final track with the extra patterns and the actual ending as it goes along. I've tweaked it a little bit. I've gone a little bit mad with power in this final version and given some elements reverb. So not reverb, delay, there's a difference. Delay is playing the same note twice after. So like what we did with the bass line, so this thing where it like plays an echo of it just after, I've kind of faked that on the lead line by actually using a real delay unit, just because it makes it sound nicer. So I've kind of cut a little bit of a corner there, but that's the wrong window, sorry. I've got too many windows. So yeah, you hear it's like, you hear that kind of like there's an echo slightly in the background. Very subtle, but it just gives it a little bit more polish. But that's essentially the only changes I've made to this final version of the track, which sounds like this. And as luck would have it, just like in Blue Peter, I've got a version of it already over here, which we can like fade through from one side to the other and have a listen to how it all sounds and compare it. So from the top. So it's not too far away. It kind of catches the character of the piece, but it loses a lot of the depth, the organic. But that's kind of how chiptune music is. You kind of have to embrace that kind of thing. kind of like lose what was there, but gain something new in the translation. So that is how you make chiptune music. Although I have to confess, this is how you make chiptune music when you use soft synthesizers. When you're making real chiptune music with real hardware, it's quite a different kettle of fish, but I've never tried that myself. And being surrounded by all these synthesizers is daunting. But yeah, I take the much more compact approach of using Reason, which has all the different synthesizers and functionality just contained inside a laptop. Okay, thanks very much. Cheers.